Welcome to FO Exclusive. August 2025. We have a lot going on. Last month in July, we covered the US reaching trade deals with EU and Japan. We covered the tectonic diplomatic shift on Palestine, and we covered the MAGA rebellion on the Jeffrey Epstein issue. This month, as I've just said, a lot has been going on. Israel's war in Gaza continues, even as much of the world is increasingly outraged. In fact, outrage is not just outside Israel. There's dissent even inside Israel. Around 600 former Israeli security officials wrote to US President Donald Trump, urging him to press Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, and his government to end the war in Gaza. Note that the signatories include former heads of Mossad and Shin Bet. Mossad does external intelligence, Shin Bet does internal intelligence. Signatories also include generals in the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. The letter these worthies have written to Donald Trump says that Israel has accomplished its military goals against Hamas. The letter goes on to say that the deal to release the remaining hostages in Gaza could not take place while the conflict still raged. So watch the space, a lot going on in Israel, Gaza. Of course, Israel has extended its offensive. Bibi's government is unmoved. The right-wing nutters in his government, and those are not my words, those are Joseph Olmert's words. You can watch his videos on our YouTube channel and on our website. Ben Gvir and co. Continue to be powerful. Now, even as all of that went on, what is interesting this month is that Denmark has just summoned the top US diplomat over covert influence operations in Greenland. Apparently, Glenn's former colleagues or some members of the US intelligence services have been fomenting these operations, taking a book out of Vladimir Putin's covert operations and get Greenlanders to campaign to be a part of the US. Naturally, Denmark is not pleased. I can tell you my Danish friends are certainly not pleased. So that is a major development, influence operations against a NATO ally. On the positive side, Donald Trump has supposedly brokered a deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So maybe there's one great achievement for him to get his Nobel Peace Prize. Armenia and Azerbaijan have fought many skirmishes and indeed wars. Azerbaijan has kicked out all the Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh, and there was tension even over Nakhchivan. You can read more. We have pieces on it, including a piece by yours truly. But that supposedly now is all over. There'll be peace for our times, as Neville Chamberlain once memorably said. And speaking of Neville Chamberlain, let's talk about Europe. Immigration this month has taken center stage. So what has happened regarding immigration? Well, the Italian government, who's led by Giorgia Meloni, and who is supposedly from the right or far right, certainly, some claim she's far right, even fascist. Who knows? She's very popular with Donald Trump and Narendra Modi and a number of European leaders. Her eye roll has gone viral.
I'll talk about fascists once we get there.
Pardon me?
I will talk about fascists once we get there. So
excellent. Well, Giorgia Meloni's eye roll is very popular. And Giorgia Meloni, or Lady Georgia, is probably rolling her eyes, and she has reacted furiously. Her government has reacted furiously to a ruling by the European Court of Justice. Basically, the ECJ has said that Italy must rethink its policy of sending migrants to Albania for processing. The UK and France have also had an immigration deal, or I shouldn't say use the word also, they have implemented an agreement formalizing the return of illegal migrants crossing the channel in small boats. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer claimed that the one in, one out policy, meaning one would get to stay, one would be sent back to France, would send a clear message to illegal channel crossing immigrants. Former Tory leader, or former Tory now, not just leader, Rory Stewart, who runs the podcast, along with Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's former spin doctor, the rest is politics, disagreed. He takes the view that the UK should turn back all illegal immigrants so that there is no incentive for anyone to cross the channel. Nigel Farage, the leader of Britain's anti-migration reform UK party, announced a plan on Tuesday, actually yesterday, to repeal human rights laws to allow for mass deportations of asylum seekers. Action, Farage claims, is absolutely essential to prevent major civil disorder. Those are his words. So, hey-ho, there we go. Immigration continues to roil Europe. And while immigration continues to roil Europe, when we go east, all the way to the land of the rising sun, to Japan, this month, Japan won a $6.5 billion contract to build Navy frigates for Australia. This is the most important defense deal Japan has won since it ended a ban on exporting military equipment in 2014. These frigates will be highly automated. They will be able to operate with a crew of 90. Currently, Australian frigates use about 180 sailors. So not just a new contract, but also an automated warship that is more efficient, which really announces Japan as a major or potentially major defense supplier in the future. Japan is remilitarizing. Japan is becoming a normal nation, bit by bit, step by step. Of course, the Chinese won't be too pleased. Of course, at some point, some other countries may also get nervous, but this is a major development this month. Now we get to Africa, and I'm afraid we have grim news from Africa.
We have to jump over Africa. No one's ever paid attention to Africa.
Okay, all right. Basically, violence continues in both Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And let's go on to Bolivia, where something major has happened. Remember, there was a time in Latin America, socialists were on the ascendant, the pink tide had taken over. Now, after 20 years in power, Movement to Socialism, MAS, won barely 3% of the vote in the first round of Bolivia's presidential elections. Rodrigo Paz, a centrist, came in first. He will face off Jorge Quiroga, a right-wing former president, who came second. There is a final round that'll occur later. This is an issue Fair Observer has covered well, and again, you can watch interviews on our YouTube channel and on our website. Now we move on from Bolivia, which is turning to the right, to Elon Musk, a man of the right. This is...
I am a space fanatic. I've wanted to be an astronaut since John Glenn flew over my head when I was a boy. My name precedes his orbit. But important as that is, dear as that is to my heart, I think we need to move on to our next focus.
Okay, so let me rifle through very quickly. He's got 15% of Tesla shares after threatening to quit. SpaceX Starship has gone to space, come back, and on the business front, what we've seen is Trump is considering taking a 10% stake in Intel. That is important by converting the CHIPS Act into equity. He's called for CEO Lip-Bu Tan to step down, so interference in business. I thought people of the right were for business and for free markets, but we see a strange kind of government interference. He's also suggested that David Solomon should stand down as boss of Goldman Sachs. after the bank apparently made a bad prediction on the effect of tariffs. And of course, Trump being Trump, he said that Solomon should focus on being a DJ because Solomon once did some DJing. America and China suspended the imposition of retaliatory tariffs for another 90 days as they continue to work towards a trade deal. November 10 is the new deadline. In contrast, today, August 27, Wednesday, August 27, Donald Trump has hit most Indian goods with tariffs of 50%. Note that FOI predicted this. Glenn is a senior partner at FOI. I'm a partner at FOI. We predicted this in April 2024. Cassandras are not heeded, though. The Indian government, both politicians and bureaucrats, as well as Indian business leaders, told us that, look, India is strategically important to the US. And more importantly, Donald Trump and Narendra Modi are great friends. So tariffs are out of the question. I guess we were right, they were wrong. And we will now turn to the three issues we'll focus on this month. Our top three issues for August 2025 are: 1, Donald Trump's assault on the federal government; 2, dramatically deteriorating US economic governance; 3, the story of Alaska and Washington, D.C. summits. Glenn, over to you. Donald Trump's assault on the federal government. The floor is yours.
Now, each of the topics that you so briefly touched upon, and I'm not being facetious, is are in and of themselves worthy of tremendous, intense focus. They are all very important, and I think, as all of us can see and know, and should be alarmed by, concerned about, we are living the most significant time historically since World War II. There are just phenomenal changes occurring in international relations, in the relative conduct of rules followed or ignored by international governance, in economic structures and organization, technological developments which have economic and sociological consequences. It's just astounding, really, what we are living. And the one I will talk about to start, for all of the apprehensions of media and opponents of Donald Trump and supporters of Donald Trump, I think remains largely misunderstood, and more than that, ignored. People are not aware of the hugely significant, historically significant foundations and objectives of what Donald Trump's administration is doing to the federal government of the United States, which, because the United States remains the 900-pound or 400-kilo gorilla in the China shop, or to mix all sorts of metaphors, affects the entire world. So what's happening? And to start, as I always do, I'll look backwards. And by, I don't think I can say happy coincidence, nonetheless a remarkable one. One of my classmates, not an intimate, not a friend, but someone I knew a little, I'm sure he would not remember me from then, I don't believe, at Harvard 50 years ago and more, was a man named Grover Norquist. Grover Norquist, in political circles in the United States, is well known, although not a prominent figure in the media. Beyond that, he's not well known. And he has organized now for 50 years something called the Wednesday Morning Group. And that's a meeting every Wednesday morning of the prominent figures, several prominent figures in the Republican Party, to plan strategy. His objective was, and I'll quote Grover, well, at the time that we were classmates, he was widely considered a gadfly, good-natured irritant, and not someone to be taken particularly seriously. All of this was wrong, because Grover had
He's had the last laugh, Glenn. He's had the last laugh, Glenn.
Absolutely. He had a clear objective, a very coherent ideology, which he has pursued as a true believer and a sincere one. And we are now living the consequences, or the realization of his lifelong work. And he is one of the significant figures in the last 50 years. And what is his objective? I'll quote Grover. I do not want to abolish the government. And by government, he means the federal government of the United States. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and then drown it in the tub. Unquote. So he thought, ho, 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 this is, he's one of these zealots and so on. But I and many, many others made a mistake that moderate and rational people always do, which to find something out is to dismiss something that is so outlandish from the norm that it seems absurd. And most of the time that is correct. But in this instance, it was not correct. And that is the objective of the Trump administration. Now, Donald Trump has adopted this, embraced this, and is pursuing this with the talents and skills that he has. But he doesn't care, really. However, the thinking people in his administration do. Yes, sorry.
Glenn, if I may, my conversations with a number of admittedly junior people in the Trump administration and those coming from the right, I meet them regularly to figure out how they think, and especially with a heritage background. They're very much fanatical. They're almost like your ancestors, the Puritans on the Mayflower. They believe in truth with a capital T. They believe government is fundamentally a drag on the economy. Regulation has killed competitiveness in the US. Bureaucrats are leeches who live off taxes and are not productive. They believe that government should get out of the way. They very much venerate, even worship Ronald Reagan, who said that government should get out of the way, should get off people's backs, and mocked, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So they very much are ideological. They have a crusading zeal when it comes to limiting the footprint of the US federal government. So I can attest to the belief systems of the younger people in the government.
Well, absolutely. And you literally anticipate the exact next point that I was going to get to go from Grover Norquist to the American Enterprise Institute, and in particular now the Heritage Foundation. When I was still working, the roles in some sense were reversed. The AEI was far more conservative and the Heritage Foundation far more moderate. That has reversed now, but that doesn't really matter. And their objective is that small government is good and government is the ill. To simplify all of this historical background, it's fundamental. We could imagine, and I'll be disparaging and facetious, but also accurate. Imagine the Republican theoreticians as adolescents who have suffered arrested development and remain obsessed by Ayn Rand and the Fountainhead. She is the goddess, just about, of their philosophy, which is that government's in the way. If you can't help yourself, you should fail and die, and everyone else should have very sharp elbows and take care of themselves. And that exalts freedom, and government is by definition oppressive. That's it. That's their objective.
But she was coming from her background. She came from a communist background. She was reacting, as was Milton Friedman, to their own Eastern European / Russian / Soviet roots, and they did not have the Anglo-Saxon tradition of democracy, of rule of law, of debate and discussion. So they immediately reacted to anything to do with government. And Ayn Rand, for all her libertarianism, was actually quite authoritarian in running her cult. In fact, she made her husband wear bells on his shoes so that he wouldn't disturb her and her much younger lover.
Right. So the background is Grover Norquist, not alone, but he has been the most successful and focused and driven, and around him has cohered and been coordinated this philosophical movement, which is quite coherent. as expressed by the intellectuals in the Heritage Foundation, in particular, in recent years. What is their goal? Their goal is, and I quote, to reduce the size of the federal government by 50%. The only roles that the federal government of the United States should have are national defense, which means the military, and border security. So does any of this ring any bells? Well, it certainly should. So what has happened as a result of this philosophical background and objective now making policy for the Republican Party and Donald Trump? Well, we've seen a broad attack in the 6 months or 8, whatever, 7 months of the second Trump administration on the federal government. 150,000 federal employees have been fired in the past 6 months. That's about 6% of the federal workforce. Entire agencies have been eliminated and gutted. The U.S. Agency for International Development is essentially killed. The Department of State has suffered. USAID has suffered substantial reductions in personnel. The Directorate of National Intelligence and the intelligence community, the same. The CIA is talking about a reduction in force, which means eliminating about 25% of its employees. The Federal Emergency Management Administration, called FEMA, which responds to hurricanes, disasters, floods, forest fires, human disasters anywhere in the country, is in turmoil and is being decimated. Or decimated literally only means 1/10 killed, and so it will be much more than decimated. The National Institutes of Health is being gutted. The Center for Disease Control is being gutted. NASA's budget is proposed to be 50% lower than its previous budget. Research and development via federal money going to universities and other institutions, private and public, is dramatically down, which serves a double ideological objective of reining in, cowing, controlling, destroying the woke, liberal, elite intellectuals on the coasts, who are, by definition, the foils and the enemy of the true Americans and the Republican Party and the small government believers, and the populists, who are inseparable from this whole movement. And then the 2026 budget proposal, the current budget proposal of the Trump administration, is a 22.6%. So let's call it a 1/4 reduction in size. Now, the budget has not been passed yet, but that's the proposal on the table. So if the objective is 50%, you don't go from 0 to 50. You go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 22.6%, and then you carry on. Now, why is this happening? The objective is not only to reduce the size of the federal government by 50%, but at the same time to make the United States government radically different in its functions and its organization. And this gets back to something I've touched on before, which is called the theory of unitary executive power, which was first developed explicitly in the modern era by Carl Schmitt, who was the lawyer for Adolf Hitler and for Nazi Germany, whose view is that anything that challenges the authority and the agency of the chief executive must be eliminated or destroyed. The chief executive must have all authority. That's a dictatorship. Let me quote from Project 2025, which is the doctrinal, philosophical, and policy guidebook for the Trump administration. Quote, the entire executive branch must be brought under direct presidential control. That's radically different than the system of government that has evolved in the United States explicitly with intent, which is to have a government of laws where agencies and administrative organizations of the government are mandated by law and Congress and the executive, as the laws are passed, to carry out their missions according to various legislation, independent of any individual or any one part of the government, independent of the executive. Unitary executive theory will eliminate that and give all power to the White House. As I said, the government only has two functions under this theory, which is national defense, and there the budget proposal is up, I think, 9%. At the same time that the overall budget is going down 21 quarter, and border control. And we've had hundreds of thousands of people, I forget the exact number, but it's in the hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens who have been detained, held, and expelled from the United States. And that is just, as the administration says, the beginning of what they intend to do. They've talked before during the campaign of deporting 13 million people in the United States, which is 5%, 4% of the population, or something to that effect. So the goal and the result of all of this, I'll quote from an unimpeachable source, Merriam-Webster. What is fascism? Fascism is a populist political philosophy, a movement or a regime that exalts the nation and often a race above the individual, and that is associated with a centralized autocratic government headed by a leader, they say dictatorial leader, that is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and by forcible suppression of opposition. Pardon me for doing this, but I have been warning about this in public for well over a decade. I was contending with, as were many, of course, many people in the government with these specific initiatives and efforts over 20 years ago during the first Bush administration, when the unitary executive theory of power was starting to be pushed for and implemented by the office of the vice president, then Richard Cheney. And this is what is happening, why the assault of the Trump administration is not incoherent. It is not irrational. One can actually support it if one thinks that those are the right ways to organize a government. But it is revolutionary in a literal sense in the United States. I find it appalling and terrifying. 80 million people were killed as a result of movements of this sort 80 years ago in a hideous war. And that is what is happening, which leads us, terribly, but logically enough, to our next topic, which is the deteriorating ways that the United States economic levers of power administration are organized and run. And with that, I will not happily, but sadly, turn over the what do they call the fascistic
the baton
the
or
fasces,
baton, as you say,
the fasces to Atul, who knows something about centralized economic control from his entire life.
So, deteriorating economic governance, topic 2 this month, deteriorating economic governance. So, what is happening? If you look at what the US government is doing, it's undermining the credibility of critical institutions responsible for economic governance. And another important development is occurring, which is that the US Treasury is attempting to control both fiscal and monetary policy. Why is this important? Because this is something that we associate with developing countries. Recep Tayyip Erdogan wanted lower interest rates and the central bank went along. And of course, the end result was high inflation. And
if I can just jump in, we do tend to say developing countries. That seems to be the acceptable term, much like someone says that someone is alternatively abled instead of a cripple today. However, developing economies, whatever the term was that you just used, really is a euphemism for countries that are poorly organized economically and that have performed poorly. Now, whether they did so because they were oppressed, they were exploited, all of this is possibly true, but doesn't change the fact that the economies themselves are catastrophic, but largely because of their performance and the way they are organized.
Perfect. So generally, we've over a period of trial and error come to a situation where fiscal policy is generally handled by government. So how much to tax, how much to spend, how much debt to take, etc., etc. Whilst monetary policy is operated by an independent central bank so that the politicians don't have the temptation to lower interest rates just before the election, so that they don't run a stop-go economy. And because, of course, if you lower interest rates, you win the election, then, of course, afterwards you'll get the hangover. But then, who cares? You won the election. And even Britain went through this problem earlier. But over time, most functioning economies have a separation of fiscal and monetary policy. So the US Treasury, wanting control of both in keeping with the line, in keeping in line with the theory of unitary executive, is a bloody bad idea. Now, let's get into specifics. So Donald Trump fired the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, after poor job numbers. So why is this important? Well, for a start, this rattled the 2.1 trillion Treasury inflation protected securities market, TIPS market. And what exactly is TIPS? Well, TIPS are government securities that adjust payouts and principal repayments based on the official inflation rate. Okay. Now, who calculates the inflation rate? BLS. So if you fire someone because you don't like the numbers, and yes, this was someone appointed by his predecessor, Joe Biden, but this person, this lady, was a highly respected civil servant economist, and she, for all practical purposes, to the best of our knowledge, or to the knowledge of any analyst of markets, was not a hack, was not someone who fiddled with the numbers. Didn't want to make Biden look good or Trump look bad. The numbers are the numbers. But hey-ho, in this new world order or new American order we live in, numbers are not exactly numbers. They're good and bad, good or bad. And so instead of this civil servant economist, Trump has brought in E.J. Anthony III, who wrote the blueprint for Trump 2.0, Project 2025, which we perused in some detail before the elections, and we were rather alarmed, which talked about imposing tariffs on India, by the way. Anyway, long story
Rather
short.
alarmed is another euphemism, Atul. I was appalled, horrified, terrified, furious, derisive, dismissive, and profoundly concerned. I mean, this single act, but you're going to talk about many more. This single act, how does the United States, is the United States now any different than China? And whoever has given any credence to data coming out of the central, from the Chinese Communist Party, you look to the CIA for objective data. Not only the CIA, but you look to the CIA for objective data about Chinese economic performance, because they all parrot the great leader. And what are we now finding is happening here?
Exactly. So the point is that if the government starts fiddling with the numbers, especially inflation figures, then those who hold TIPS would lose their hedge against inflation. So this is bad for US bonds. This is bad for US period in the long run, if not the short run. Our sources in the federal government reveal that employees are panicking after this firing. They believe that the credibility of figures on jobs, inflation, and other key economic indicators will worsen. Alarmingly, Trump called the BLS employment situation summary phony and rigged because it reported that the US economy generated only 72,000 jobs in July. The BLS also made, BLS meaning Bureau of Labor Standards, also made, sorry, Bureau of Labor Statistics, my fault, my apologies. The BLS also made downward revisions showing 258,000 fewer jobs for May and June than previously reported. Obviously, Donald Trump got angered. He fired the commissioner, and both the low jobs figure and the revisions, appear consistent with reporting over recent years. Look, the BLS produces jobs report using survey responses. They are often turned in late, so estimates replace actual survey responses. Revisions
Well,
are
this is
made.
this is actually I'm sorry, pardon me, Atul. This is a normal
Yeah,
process and at
yeah,
present an unavoidable process in the data collection and public assessment and publication
yes,
of economic data. The first figures that come out are always based on um, incomplete data, and it takes several months for the full data to come in and be coordinated and assessed in a meaningful way,
exactly.
which is why there are always revised figures given, which sometimes go up and sometimes go down for inflation rates and employment data and so on and so forth. It's a normal part of the process with no political
Exactly.
bent or objective whatsoever.
That was the whole point of creating these institutions. So, yes, people have political leanings. That is certainly true. Yes, sometimes there can be influence, but largely the difference between a US and a UK and the EU and, let's say, Turkey or India or Russia or China is that you can't exactly rely on numbers in these countries. Now, revisions generally, invariably, are made after late responses come in. And now federal employees are worrying that if they report data in good faith, if they gather it following standard procedures, and they publish it, then the Trump administration might fire them if the numbers show the Trump administration in unfavorable light. Now, this is massive. Uh, what does this mean going forward? Well, it means that inflation data could become less reliable. It basically subjective assessments applied in calculating inflation data might become more subjective. Already, there is suspicion amongst economists that the composition of goods and services, including in the calculation and their relative weighting, which is open to judgment and reinterpretation in multiple ways, is not exactly kosher anymore. For example, the BLS reported that the cost of food at home increased by 2.2% in the year to July 2025. Over the same period, the BLS also reported that the prices of milk, eggs, chicken, and bananas rose by 4.5%, 16.9%, 4.5%, and 7.2%, respectively. And this is the sort of number crunching that the managing partner of FOI, um, Sanjay Acharya, has been doing, and Alex Gloy, our editor at large, who's a rather sharp economist, a rather sharp cookie with Teutonic rigor. He's German after all. He's been looking into numbers and saying, maybe there is something fishy going on. So now, with the added threat of job loss, statisticians can be expected to make sure headline figures are acceptable to the Trump administration, even if the headline data tells a different story. Now, Trump didn't just fire the BLS chief. He also removed the Internal Revenue Service Commissioner, Billy Long. At least Billy Long gets to go to Iceland as ambassador, so maybe he can have fine fish and enjoy the
Hot springs.
volcanoes, hot springs. So Billy Long maybe doesn't have it too bad. He was a congressman, I believe, from Missouri, a Midwest congressman. And now he's been replaced by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Now, obviously, Scott Bessent doesn't have enough to do. He has to impose tariffs. He has to find someone to replace the current Federal Reserve big boss, and so on and so forth. But yeah, he's a very efficient man. He is the brightest person since Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Anyway, long story short, Bessent is the seventh person to head the IRS in 2025. He is the sixth boss of the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, under Trump. Already, the IRS has faced sweeping cuts thanks to Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, Doge. So there's complete upheaval and pandemonium within the IRS, and which raises the question as to whether they'll be able to effectively collect taxes and whether all this
Well,
upheaval in
and
IRS.
unstated, that's an important point, Atul, and it's not stated explicitly and openly. It's not something that the
Yeah.
policymakers or those who are generating the policy ideas will acknowledge. But there's a clear path that leads from the eviscerating of the IRS to Project 2025 and the reduction in size and capabilities and mission of the federal government, and to the Republicans' obsession or preference for low taxes. Low taxes means smaller government, means more freedom, and that's all good, 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 good. It doesn't matter that if there's the deficit, because as you say, if you have sugar today, then you feel great, and the fact that you become fat tomorrow is somebody else's problem. Or you use the hangover analogy, but that's what's happening. It's been assessed by, I think it was the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, over years, that reducing the personnel and the modernization steps that the Biden administration was taking in the IRS would cost the federal government in revenue a minimum of $80 billion per year. And that was just for a start in the effects that were being assessed on the effects on the IRS. So, but it's all a coherent part of kneecapping and rendering incapable parts of the federal government because they shouldn't exist.
All right. Speaking of the federal government, now we move on to the Federal Reserve, the Fed. Now, here, the Trump administration is aiming to change the leadership. They've already fired one governor. So, what is the Federal Reserve? The Fed is the central bank of the US. It is charged with the dual mandate of promoting maximum employment and stable prices. A 7-member board leads the Fed. Members are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate for a term of 14 years, with a vacancy occurring every 2 years. So every 2 years, one person goes out, a new person comes in. The design is such because the idea is it'll bring in fresh blood whilst ensuring continuity. The Fed sets the target interest rate range that US banks use to borrow and lend money overnight. This rate influences short-term interest rates and indicates the monetary policy stance of the Fed. For instance, the Fed cut rates both after the 2007 and 2007 to 2009 Great Recession and the COVID pandemic. The goal, stimulate the economy. So when the economy slows down, the Fed cuts interest rates. Conversely, when the economy is heating up, the Fed has raised interest rates to cool down the inflation. So the Fed's goal is to keep the economy at an even keel, to make sure that the American financial system works smoothly. The Fed generally has had high credibility, even though people have blamed Alan Greenspan for keeping interest rates too low for too long. People also complained about Paul Volcker, who was the Federal Reserve boss appointed by Jimmy Carter, who raised interest rates and killed inflation. So we've had complaints, but largely the Fed has been independent. But now Donald Trump in June 2025 suggested he may force something on the Fed. And he set out his monetary policy whilst insulting Powell. We've covered all of this in our FOI Geopolitical Risk Monitor for August 2025. For instance, we point out that Donald Trump said, if we cut our interest rate, if we cut our interest by 1 point for years, we save 300 billion. If we cut it by 2 points, we save 600 billion a year. 600 billion because of one numbskull that sits here. I don't see enough reason to cut the rates. No, I don't know how that's coherent, but the point is Trump wants lower interest rates. The Federal Reserve, led by Powell, Jerome Powell, is not exactly playing ball. So he's targeted Jerome Powell. Now he's gone after Lisa Cook. And the charge is she falsified bank documents and property records to acquire more favorable loan terms. The DOJ is investigating Cook. Um, we don't know if the firing is entirely legal as well, because the president cannot fire a governor at will. It's only, I believe, at cause or on cause. He has to show cause. Of course, she's going to take the matter to court, but the reality is that markets are very nervous, um, because now the U.S. president and the U.S. Treasury Secretary are intent on rolling over the Fed and are firing people and are bringing in charges. Remember, Fed independence has been an article of faith in American politics since 1971. What happened that year? Richard Nixon, then president, abandoned the gold standard. I already mentioned Fed Chair Paul Volcker, 1979 to 1986. He brought inflation under control. And for decades, markets worldwide have had faith in the Fed. And the Fed's credibility has been one of the pillars um, to the dollar's role as the global reserve currency and the linchpin of the global economy. So yes, please.
This is a critical point, but there's, I would argue, an even larger point happening. The independence of the Fed is an example of the separation of authorities and powers, but intentionally, so that the United States is a government of laws rather than a government of men, or in particular, a man. This is why the FBI director 50 years ago was given an independent period of mandate in office, rather than solely it was the intent solely at the discretion of the president, so that rather than having the FBI under Herbert Hoover be either an independent power that could be malign or beneficial, or a tool of the executive, it was a law enforcement agency independent of political pressure, to the extent one could create an institution that way. Similarly with the Fed, just as you've been describing. And when one eliminates these protections, none of which are ever ironclad or perfect, then one has a government of a man. And perhaps that man or woman, perhaps at some time, will make good decisions and perhaps not. But maybe even if the decision is good, it will be opposed by a significant percentage of the population. It's not supposed to be a government of an individual, but a government representing the people as embodied and administered through the laws and the institutions created to apply them. And this destroys, this being what Trump is attempting to do to the Fed in this specific instance, destroys all of that.
Yes, and why are Trump and Bessent trying to do this? They have their reasons. And the reasons are they believe that if they cut interest rates, they will cut the cost of servicing America's ballooning debt. By 2034, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA, will add an estimated $4.1 trillion to US debt. And so their theory is, okay, if we cut down, if we devalue the dollar, if we have inflation reduce the burden on the US government of financing and paying down US debt, then we can manage the debt. We can inflate away the debt. A lower funds rate is usually it leads to lower effective rates on short-term government borrowing. It lowers interest payments if higher cost long-term debt is replaced with short-term debt. Even a 1% difference in the interest rate paid on government debt is material when total borrowing exceeds $37 trillion. I repeat, $37 trillion. So yes, there is a problem. Yes, it is a big problem. But is this the way to solve it? I don't know. The other assumption behind reducing interest rates is that it'll stimulate US economic activity. The job numbers are not great, so let's lower let's lower interest rates. Once we lower interest rates, then more people, more businesses will take money out, invest, more people will spend, and the economy, which is slowing down, will start, the wheel of economy will start moving faster, rotating faster. All these assumptions are fallacious. Why? Because this interference is destroying what John Maynard Keynes, arguably one of the greatest economists who's ever lived, are damaging animal spirits. The economy is a lot about animal spirits, which basically mean confidence. Investors are worried, business leaders are worried, economists are worried. Everyone is dreading the stop-go effect. Fed economists are worrying about the return of 1970s style stagflation, a combination of low growth and high inflation. So the key point we want to make is that critical US economic institutions are losing independence and credibility, increasing the risk of an economic crisis. Now, on to our third point. Point number 3.
We go from one disaster to another, or perhaps from disaster to farce and disaster.
Yeah. The story of Alaska and Washington summits. Point 3, the story of, just let me finish. Point 3, the story of Alaska and Washington summits. As Glenn said, a farce, even more than a disaster. Over to you, Glenn.
Well, so Donald Trump has said, we all have heard many times, in fact, it was 53 times during his campaign, that it would take him 24 hours to solve the war in Ukraine, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He then said something that he tends to say with regularity also, is no one knew that the problem was so complex after 6 months of flailing and achieving nothing. So there were 2 summits that Donald Trump held, one in Anchorage with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, and one in Washington with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and in haste, several of the key leaders of Europe and NATO, European countries and NATO. What were the results of, and the objective of each meeting was to find a peace agreement, terms to end the war going on in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine. The results have been no peace. There's no agreement in view whatsoever, no change whatsoever.
To warn our listeners, we will overshoot. So those of you who want can stay on, because this is a consequential month. This has been a historic month, and therefore we will overshoot. Those of you who want to go can go at 1 p.m., but we'll crack
on. So no peace came out of this whatsoever. There's no agreement at all, none in view. However, Russia has been partially rehabilitated from its international pariah status by the man in the Oval Office, Donald Trump. The United States aligned itself, as it has done for a decade under Donald Trump, verbatim to the last iota with Russia's positions. But then at the same time, the United States agreed to sell American weapons material to NATO members, which NATO members could then give, if they wish, to Ukraine. So at the same time, the U.S. is aligning itself with Russia and agreeing to provide weapons to Ukraine to oppose Russia, which is, of course, totally incoherent. What's the substance of all of this? There were 5 participants, actually, at the 2 summits. There was Russia, the United States, Ukraine, key European, NATO and European member countries, and Donald Trump's ego. And I say that because it does get a smile, but it also is absolutely true. And that his ego was the most important driver and objective of the 2 summits. And I'm not being facetious. Each participant pursued larger objectives, and often incompatible ones, than merely peace between Ukraine and Russia, which all would like on their own terms. The Russian president, Putin, sought to end his diplomatic isolation, to improve relations with the United States, to advance his view of the root causes of the Russia-Ukraine war, which means that Ukraine does not exist as a society or a legitimate country and the government is illegitimate. to achieve peace on his terms, which means that we will absorb Ukraine, Russia, and to undermine the normative system of international relations that has haltingly obtained since 1945 and replace it with a sphere of interest system which Russia's influence in Central Europe, at least, would be preponderant, and Russia would have a roughly equal influence and status with that of the United States, although it is 1/40th the size economically, or who knows what it is. Putin has a chance to achieve all these goals because Donald Trump has for decades parroted Russian positions, and he has more than a Freudian affinity for strongmen and for Vladimir Putin, and the Russian connection I talked about other times. The United States sought to end the war in Ukraine. The United States government, but the United States government was largely irrelevant in this. Under Donald Trump, this has meant that the United States aligned its positions with those of Russia. That's literally the case. And also, the consequence was weakening America's commitment to NATO and to European defense, although the European leaders succeeded in stopping that from going as far as it may have. Ukraine, of course, sought to maintain its independence and its capability to resist, which meant maintaining its critical alliance with the United States so that it could receive aid. And it wanted to avoid anything which would weaken its sovereignty over even the territories that are its legally, but it doesn't currently control. The EU and NATO leaders, who invited themselves in haste to try to avoid the giveaway of Ukraine and the triumph of Russia, sought to maintain U.S. commitment to NATO and to stop the United States from trying to impose a peace favorable to Russia. And the most important player in all this was Donald Trump, who sought a peace agreement before having worked out either a U.S. position or any tentative accord among any of the interested parties. But his really his primary objective was to focus the world's spotlight on him, to be the man in the center, to whom everyone had to appear to make obeisance to be the flame around which all moths turned and flew. And if the result helped his friend Vladimir, so much the better. And if it guaranteed Ukraine's independence, well, okay. Now the consequence, and then I think I can bring us to an end. The consequence in substance was for Ukraine and Russia in their war essentially zero at present. There is no peace agreement, and it continues to recede with the horizon as the artillery shells fly and their drones fly over the Donbass, and the Russians send 1,000 people a day into Ukrainian drones and machine guns to die. But he did succeed, Trump did succeed in holding a conference at which he was the center of attention. And then the final consequence was a continuing fraying of the United States credibility, trust, and the faith that other countries have in it, and in what remains of the tattered normative system, rather now being replaced by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping's objective, a sphere of influence system where power determines who has predominance.
Glenn, I mean, yes, Donald Trump did all of that, but it's very clear that in the Alaska summit, Vladimir Putin had the upper hand. One person looked rather cheery. It was, as one of my friends, British friends, summed it up, from the photo, even before reading any news report, he said it was clear which cat got the cream. The photograph, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, that photo said it all. And the reality is that Donald Trump has little leverage now against Vladimir Putin because he doesn't want to send arms and money to Ukraine. And when it comes to the Europeans are effete. That is indubitably true. You do not have a Charles de Gaulle as a European leader. You do not have Europeans who want to fight and die. You do not have Europeans who are willing to put money. The popularity of most European leaders at home is near rock bottom. I mean, look at Keir Starmer. There are people within his party talking of replacing him. His popularity is going down. That of Nigel Farage is going up. You look at Emmanuel Macron. he does not have much credibility anymore within France. He's despised as President Jupiter, the Jupiterian president, or whatever he claimed to be. You go to Christopher Merz, he barely squeaked through and got his majority at the second attempt. And Germans, yes, the Germans are investing more in defense, but AFD is on the rise, and AFD, we know, believes that Germany should take Russian gas and focus on the economy and kick immigrants out. So Europe is no longer as cohesive as it was. Europe no longer has the ability to take the pain. Europe is an aging continent, and therefore European leaders were genuflecting so abjectly in front of Donald Trump, who's clearly someone they don't exactly admire or even like. I mean, look at all their comments before the elections and look at how they are groveling at his feet. So, yes, I agree with you, all of this has happened, but there are wheels within wheels. And it is clear that the war in Ukraine is not going well for Ukrainians. They simply don't have enough men. The men have fled the country, far too many. They are getting 60-plus-year-olds. So it's a grim situation. And the consequences are going to be grimmer. And talking about the rules-based order, if the president is not following the rules at home, if he's ordered, and we didn't talk about this at all, we forgot that he's ordered National Guard in Washington, D.C. I see them when I walk around. I say hello to them. They're perfectly pleasant. They've come in to just stand at street corners. If you have a collapse of law internally, it's really hard to say there's a normative order externally, given all that's going on. So we are living fin de siècle sort of way. We are living in an order akin to pre-World War One, or we could say, I wouldn't say pre-World War Two, when a certain order was crumbling, we didn't know what would follow. By 1920, women had the votes, and a certain Winston Churchill had opposed votes for women, and a suffragette had nearly thrown him in front of an onrushing train. But fast forward 1920, women had the vote. And of course, Churchill changed his mind because women voted for him in large numbers. And so he said, if I had known so many of them would vote the right way, or words to that effect, I would have supported their vote. So maybe we are living at some Zeitenwende, but we don't know where the winds or where the age will turn. We don't know where the zeitgeist will take us, but certainly the old order is dead, and we don't know what new order is to be born.
So all happy news. We could have talked about the Starship launch, and then that would have been a bit of positive news. But then we would have to talk about AI and how we're all going to become drones to artificial intelligence. But that's our survey of the darkening clouds.
Exactly. And we will see you a month hence in September. Thank you very much. See you anon.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.